welcome back to GTA's Technology Summit for the next session, which is Good Data for Good Decisions on Broadband. With me today, we have Deana Perry, Executive Director at the Department of Community Affairs for Broadband Programs, and Eric McRae, Director at the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, University of Georgia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deana. I think, Deana, you're going to kick us off, right?
That's right, Bill. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The pandemic has highlighted how essential broadband is for businesses, education, healthcare, and really the whole economic ecosystem. The Georgia Broadband Availability Map has shown us that more than 1 million Georgians lack access to reliable high-speed internet services. In order to protect their health and as well as the safety of others, all across Georgia, many citizens have been working from home and educating through remote learning and utilizing many other online services. Those that have internet access transition seamlessly, but those without access internet connectivity have struggled. We have heard many of these stories in the earlier presentations today. I am Deana Perry, the Executive Director of the Department of Community Affairs for the Broadband Office. The mission, next slide, please. The mission of the Georgia Broadband Program is to promote the deployment of broadband services to unserved areas of the state. The number one barrier in providing high-speed internet to rural Georgians is due to cost. Because of population density and terrain, it is difficult to find a business model that will justify the build out without additional resources, and that is why partnerships are key to finding solutions. Why does partnering with private sector ISPs bring to the table? Expertise in design, building, operating, and maintaining a broadband network, but more importantly, capital. Local communities will play an essential role in solving this important issue. Why? Local governments can bring additional resources that can close the cost barrier gaps and advocate for where connectivity is needed for unserved homes and businesses. The GBDI team has been developing tools, next slide please, and augmenting resources to support public-private partnerships. Eric and I want to share with you the resources available to support your efforts in broadband deployment. The development of these tools and resources has been a coordinated effort across multiple state agencies that represents the work over the last couple of years for the project team that also includes the Broadband Advisory Committee. Commissioner Nunn opened the meeting today talking about the coordinating and the collaboration that we have done across agencies. These agencies are represented on the screen. The key project team members have been the Department of Community Affairs and in partnership with Georgia Technology Authority, in addition to the Department of Transportation, States Property Commission, GDEC, and certainly the resources that CVOG has brought to the team. In addition, the advisory committee has been represented by ACCG and GMA, representing local governments, as well as our provider partners, which you can see as AT&T, Comcast, Cable Association, Windstream, the Georgia Telecom Association. Next slide, please. There are a lot of broadband funds available, including a state grant program, which is why it's important that everyone be smart about why, how, with whom we invest public resources. Our purpose today is to outline the tools and resources available to communities as you consider specific projects to provide services to unserved areas. Next slide, please. The Georgia Broadband Resources tools can be used to identify unserved locations, understand technology options, understand project investment, and identify and qualify partners. CVIOG's ITOS team, led by Eric McRae, has been a vital resource to the Broadband Office in development of these tools, especially in developing the Georgia Broadband Availability Map and the utilization of the map data. So now I'd like to hand it over to Eric, who will walk us through these resources.
Thank you, Deana. So First, I want to talk a little bit about why we are mapping the way we are mapping in the state of Georgia. Currently, at a national level, the FCC is responsible for the mapping of the broadband data. For the FCC, when they map the data, they're looking to get submissions from the providers twice a year for any provider that provides service exceeding 200 kilobits per second in at least one direction. For our purposes, all of the data that we're collecting, we consider broadband to be 25 megs down and 3 megs up. When the FCC maps data, if a single location in a census block, and they map everything at the census block, as do we when we aggregate our information, but if one single location in a census block is served, then the entire census block is served. And so in this example right here, these locations right here that are green are considered to be served. All the red locations are considered to be unserved. But per the FCC, this is a served census block. We took a different approach in the state of Georgia. We define a served census block as when 20% or greater, if 20% or greater of the locations are unserved, hence 80% or greater are served, then that census block is served. And so in this case, this is an unserved census block in the state of Georgia. And that's a very distinct difference between how we map data and how the FCC maps data. We're very granular in how we map data. We're looking at every single location, and then we look at the percentage of those locations served in any given census block to determine whether or not that census block as a whole is served or unserved. When we mapped it that way, we came up with a very different looking map. The map here on the left, this is how the FCC maps the data. Everything in orange here is considered to be served. Everything in kind of the beige color is considered to be unserved. Over here, when you look at it, you can see that there are very large portions of the state of Georgia which are considered unserved. And that is because we took a location level approach versus the FCC, where it was completely a census block approach. When we were done mapping the data at the end of 2020, we had determined that there were over 507,000 locations that were unserved. 70% of those unserved locations are in rural areas. That does not mean that 70% of rural Georgia is unserved. It's just 70% of those 507,000 locations were in rural Georgia. But that did equate to be 31% of rural Georgia is unserved. In fact, there are 26 rural counties in the state of Georgia that have greater than 50% of their locations as being unserved. Part of the process of building these maps out was we wanted to make those available to anyone, the public, providers, anybody who wanted to see them. And so the GBDI came up with 4 maps that we considered that we published. And I'm going to walk through each one of these maps real quickly and just talk a little bit about what you can do with these maps. All of this is aggregated data. You cannot go and click on the map and find out if you have service at your location as far as who provides service or how much it costs or anything like that. This is all providing information as to who has access. And that's an important distinction. Access does not mean that we have people that have subscribed. This is purely an access map. And so there are really 3 issues with broadband. You have the access issue, whether or not people can even get broadband. You have affordability, and then you really have adoption as well. And so we're not looking at affordability or adoption with this. We're just looking at access with these maps. So the first map that we have is GBDI unserved by county. When you come to this map, if you select a county, it will give you the high-level statistics for that county. In this case, I selected Jasper County. And we can see that there are 4,601 unserved locations. The number of served locations is 2,710. That means the percent of unserved for that county is 63%. If we zoom into the map and get a little closer, we can select any given census block in the county, and we can determine how many locations are served, how many are unserved, and what the total percentage unserved is of that census block. And so you can get down to that detailed information at a census block level using these maps. Now, in this case right here, there are 33 served locations. There are 62 unserved locations. In the FCC model, this would be considered a served census block. The next map that we have is GBDI Unserved. And what that is it's the same information, it's just packaged a little bit differently, and it gives you the ability to do some additional features. So one thing that we wanted to be able to do was provide a query button to allow you to look for different geographies to find information about an area based upon your county, your Georgia House District, your Georgia Senate District, or your U.S. Congressional District. So we can go through here, and if we select here with this, where the red arrow is pointing, the query button on the GBDI Unserved Georgia map, we can then, this will bring up a query box, and we can select whichever geography we would like to search by. In this case, I'm going to select Senate District. So I selected Senate District 53. When I click the big green apply, that will then take me to Senate District 53, and it'll provide me the statistics on that geography. And so in this case, we have 5,642 unserved locations. We have 77,382 served locations, which means that this census or this Senate district is 7% unserved. Now you'll notice here, there's a lot of land mass, there's a lot of area which is unserved, but the population is relatively low in those areas. So it kind of offsets it. So that's why there's 7% unserved in this area. You can zoom down into this map as well and select a census block and get individual statistics if you would like. We also have what we call the FCC versus GBDI broadband comparison map. When you come to this map and you land here, the map is already set at the FCC level. There is a swipe bar in the middle of the map. If we select this swipe bar and we move it across the map, it will reveal to us what GBDI has versus what the FCC has. And so as we move this bar across the map, we can see the difference here where GBDI shows we have a lot of unserved areas versus the FCC showing a lot of served areas. You can zoom down into this map and continue to do the swipe all the way down to the census block level. Another map that we created was the free public Wi-Fi map. When the pandemic started and everybody was sent home, whether it was for school or for work, one of the challenges a lot of people had in the state was whether or not they were going to be able to have access to broadband at home. If they didn't have it, if they didn't have access to broadband, they had to find some way to get it, especially in those counties that had very high levels of unserved areas. And so we created, working with multiple different entities, a free public Wi-Fi map where you can go through, find an area, select it, and it'll provide you the information, the address, the county where it's located at, and if there's a login required, it'll have that login information, whether it's posted on the door or if there's a particular address or not a particular password. They provide that, and they also provide the hours of operation. And so we had a lot of people that were having to drive here, park here, whether they were doing a Zoom meeting or whether they were doing homework, but we had these locations to find from all across the state, and this map is continually updated. The last thing I'm going to talk about that's available on the maps section of the GBDI website is the actual map data itself. So all of the data aggregated at the census block level is available in multiple formats for you to use however you would like. We have a web mapping service if you have an online map that you'd like to add the broadband map data to. We have a CSV file, which is an Excel file that you can pull your data in and do some your own analysis. We also have a shape file if you have a GIS shop and you would like to basically bring the map in and create your own maps or overlay it with your own information so you have access to that information. When the 2021 maps are published, we will publish that data here as well in the same format. Now, Having that information would allow you to build a map like this right here. And this is a density map that we had created as just an example of looking at the data, taking the census data taking the aggregate data that we had, showing all the locations that were fully served, which are in brown, then all the different basically densities of all the different census blocks across the state of the number of unserved locations. You could do that with the map data that is available right now on the GBDI website. So with that, we have a lot of information. We know where people have access to broadband. We know where people don't have access to broadband. And so one of the things we want to look at is, who are investors who might be wanting to basically look at expanding broadband in the state beyond the citizens of the state. And when we look at that, it really boils down to you have government and you have providers. One of that government's local, state, or federal, and then the providers, any number of the 44 providers or more that exist in the state of Georgia that want to expand. Now, the goals and the reasons why these individuals want to expand are usually different, as well as their willingness to take a risk in making this expansion. So on the government side, your goals are going to be, economic efficiencies, effectiveness, basically helping improve people's lives. On the provider side of things, at the end of the day, they need to look at how do they maximize revenue and profit. There's a reason that we haven't built out into extremely expensive areas of the state. If you're a provider, it's because you don't have that return on investment. And so what we need to look at is how can we leverage local, state, and federal dollars to help providers build out into these areas so that we can basically expand broadband where we don't currently have that. An example of where the federal government is doing that is through the RDOF program. RDOF means it's the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund from the FCC. What the FCC has done is basically auctioned off census blocks that are fully unserved in the state of Georgia. And they've done this all across the country. And they've basically said, if you bid on a census block, you're gonna serve all the locations in that census block. And there's different requirements that they have to do that. Well, when they did this auction, about just shy of 180,000 locations were awarded. That still leaves about 327,000 locations unserved, but 180,000 locations served is a large improvement over what we had. When we look at the impact of that, there are 15 companies that bid and were successful in the state of Georgia bidding on RDOF dollars to the tune of $326 million that the federal government's investing in the state of Georgia over the next 10 years to build out broadband. As I said earlier, that's about 180,000 locations. The four largest awardees would be the rural electric co-ops, Windstream, Charter Cable, and SpaceX. And that's the Starlink, that's the Elon Musk satellite internet. As you can see, there's pretty good distribution all over the state for these providers. And there's additional providers that aren't shown here that would also be have won RDOF funds, but they will be much smaller than these locations. The number of locations that they'll be serving are much smaller than these awardees here. Now, the beauty of it is the speeds in which they're going to be connecting folks to in the state. The dark green represents gigabit or greater speeds. And that's gigabit down, 400 megabits up. The red areas will be above baseline. That's 100 megs down, 20 megs up. And the blue areas, which you'll notice are the smallest, they're just a couple little blue areas here and a few others scattered around the state, will be baseline, which is 50 megs up and 5 megs down. I mean, 50 megs down, 5 megs up. These speeds are all greater than what we consider broadband in the state of Georgia. So this is an excellent, excellent thing for the state of Georgia. Now, it would be great if this were all going to happen tomorrow, but unfortunately it's not. The RDOF program deployment timeline is by year 3, they're to have 40% of the locations that they bid on served. By year 4, 60%, year 5, 80%, year 6, 100%. So really we're looking at, even though it's a 10-year program, by year 6, 100% of the locations will be served. Now, that doesn't preclude a provider from expanding more quickly in an area, but what they are required to do per the RDOF stipulations is have 100% of the locations served within the next 6 years. So this is not a solution that's going to basically change overnight, but it is going to take time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure and the capital and what it takes to build out broadband. So you really have what's called middle mile, last mile, and then your location. The middle mile, which are, can be equated to things like state roads. You have the internet, basically your trunk and all that, which is like your interstate. Then from there, you have your middle mile, which is kind of get you out into the hinterland. That is 10 to 15% of the cost. These are very large trunks that kind of scatter about and go across the state. Your last mile, these are your local roads. These are basically going down every street to connect up to houses and all that. That's 85 to 90% of the cost. And so these are high costs that these providers have to undertake in order to basically connect up broadband. And they have to look at this from a business standpoint as what is their return on investment. And so, the drop cost, which is your labor, cable, and equipment, that's the actual cost to get to the location. They have to look at what is that going to cost me at the end of the day, and is this worth it? Is my return on investment, am I going to make my return on investment in a timely enough fashion that this makes it worth it? And this is where the subsidy through things like RDOF, the subsidy through the Georgia Grant Program and other programs can help offset these costs to make this a more easier to swallow situation for these providers. So that's where we get into this public-private investment. We have these different programs, whether it's RDOF, whether it's the state grant program. How do we invest these dollars? At the end of the day, the providers are still providing the lion's share of the investment, whether it's operating expense or capital expense. And the only thing that most of these programs cover is 50% of the capital expense. Well, the capital expense is only a portion of the total cost. And so really what we're looking at providing when we're talking about providing government funds is about 22.5% of the overall cost for the entire program. And so these providers are still making the largest outlay of when we're talking about when there's build out, they are still making a huge outlay. And so they're to be commended for what they're doing with that. They have to look at that though from a return on investment standpoint. The number of paying customers versus the cost to serve locations, that's going to equal the return on investment of a project over time. And so generally speaking, they're looking at a 7 or 8 year return on investment. How long does it take to get that return on investment? And so they're not expecting to basically in year 1 or year 0 to basically recover those and recoup those costs, but they need to have a model set up where they can see those costs, that return on investment coming in within about 7 or 8 years. And this is generally speaking an industry standard here. Now, one of the things that GBDI can help provide when we're working with a county or municipality or anybody else like that is we can help provide the information as who is currently providing in a given area, whether it's we can provide the number of census blocks and who the retail broadband wireline providers are. So in this example, in this county, Windstream has 268, Citizens Telco has 196, ComSouth has 188. You can kind of go through the list. We can also let you know whether or not they are RDOF awardees and how you might be able to work with these different providers to maybe edge out networks. So you may have a situation where we have some unserved census blocks, which per FCC were served, which are not part of the RDOF, but will be encapsulated by RDOF census blocks and serve census blocks, where you may be able to work with them and identify some funding to build out and continue that effort to edge out that network a little bit further and get more of your folks connected to broadband. We can do this because we have accurate data. It gives us the ability to evaluate these proposed projects and look at how we might use this information. So in this example, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the grant eligibility map here in a minute, we can look at these individual census blocks and we can see the number of unserved locations in the census block. And this is what an end user will see when they're evaluating proposed potential projects for the Georgia grant mapping program. Here at GBDI, though, we actually get to see the raw data. We can see those unserved locations and where they're located at, and we can help you with some of that information if need be, when we're looking at these areas of how we might better build out and evaluate proposed projects. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the grant eligibility map, the Georgia eligibility map. We call it the GEM map. And this is, and we're going to be releasing this before too long to allow folks to go through and pre-plan as to where they might want to build out and basically go after the grant program. This map shows, in order to be a census block on this map, it has to meet several criteria. Number one, it has to be an unserved census block right off the bat. Number two, it cannot be funded through the RDOF funding program or the USDA Reconnect funding program. That's another federal program that's in place in Georgia. It's not as large as the RDOF program, but it does exist in several counties in the state. And so those Reconnect census blocks have been removed as well. The other thing that is a requirement is you have to either be one Georgia eligible or conditionally eligible in order to participate in the Georgia grant program. And so those census blocks have been removed as well. And so what you end up with, the fallout, if you will, are all those unserved census blocks. And what we're going to provide is basically a number of locations which are in those census blocks which are unserved. And this is for the pre-application process. The full application process, once your pre-application has been approved, you'll have access to more granular information. But for the pre-application process, you'll be able to go through and you'll be able to select census blocks to kind of build up the area in which you want to partner with a provider to go after grant dollars to get built out. As you select up these census blocks, and it builds up basically a list of census blocks, and in this case, we've selected 16 eligible census blocks. When we're done, we can create a table of all these census blocks, and we can export this table as a CSV file, which we can then go through and we can then submit back to the grant program to say, these are the census blocks that we wish to go through and receive grant funds for if possible. So you'll be able to export that data down, get that down, and then send that back to us basically as identifying the census blocks in which you want to go after a grant. You can go through and build out multiple maps if necessary to get everything in it and then just aggregate everything together into a single table if you'd like. That's not a problem, but all those grant rules will be made available to you once the grant program is kicked off. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to basically leave it with, for local government assistance, we want you to contact local government GBDI support. For designation inquiries, we want you to contact Brittany Hickam. And for mapping inquiries, please contact Jason Sell. We will be happy, both Deana and I will be happy to answer any questions anybody has about what is available to you through the Broadband GBDI program.
Eric, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Bill.
Okay, here's a question. Do you have a map showing the cost or potential return on investment of upgrading broadband to minimum for unserved locations?
We do have cost information, and it's all aggregated at a census block level. We don't have it at a location level, but we have the average cost per location at a census block level. And the GBI team has access to that data, and we can work with you on that. If you'd like to contact us about that, you can contact Jason Sell at DCA, and we can help facilitate that. And I'll go ahead and say this about that cost model. We have it for multiple technologies, and this is the same cost modeling that the FCC uses, and it's a very well-respected cost model, and we have that for the entire state. It is what's known as a greenfield cost model, and so it's basically looking at what does it cost to build out if nothing exists. But for a lot of unserved areas, infrastructure does not exist, so that the cost model is accurate.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, we got another one. Any chance the FCC will shift to something with accuracy of the GBDI map?
We are hoping so. They are currently working on updating the way they map information, and they're modeling it. I won't say they're modeling, but they're using a lot of the same methodologies that we're using. They're going to be moving away from a census block level map. They may still report it at census block level, but they're going to start gathering, instead of having the providers provide their information at a census block level, they want to start receiving that information at a footprint level. It's the same actual methodology that the GBDI program moved to this year, where we collect information at a footprint level. And we didn't get that from every single provider. Some of us still provided address lists, and we had to go through and map all that, but most of the providers were able to provide us a footprint of where they serve. And that is where the FCC is moving towards. Now, what their end product looks like, no one knows yet, but I anticipate within the next 2 years, we will probably see a much improved FCC map.
2 years, huh?
Well, I may be optimistic. I know that they have thrown they're going to be throwing a lot of money towards it, so they should be able to do it within 2 years.
Well, you've taught them how to do it, right?
Exactly. We actually have, and the state of Georgia has been approached, and we have talked to the Governmental Accountability Office on multiple occasions about how we did our mapping. The map in the state of Georgia is considered the gold standard. And so we should be proud as Georgians of what we have built as a state, because it is being recognized across the nation as being the gold standard.
The gold standard. Yeah, I like that. Another question. The question is, they're asking for confirmation. Do we need to do a pre-application of blocks that they would be interested in applying for in the grant program?
Deana, you want to answer that? You want me to?
Sure. I'll be going over a little bit more in my presentation later this afternoon, but there will be a pre-application window. And as Eric illustrated in his presentation, there will be an eligibility mapping tool that identifies, that helps the applicant identify their proposed project area.
Okay, here's another question. The statement is gold standard for Georgia is great. What other organizations have good broadband use maps?
Well, there are multiple other states that are working on different variations of maps other than Georgia. South Carolina, I think it was South Carolina was working on one where they used the Ookla speed test data to basically generate maps that showed areas where there appeared to be good connectivity. There's some challenges with using the Ookla data, in my opinion, to create a map of that with any specificity. And that's why one reason we're using the approach we're using. But like I said, there's multiple other states that are now taking it upon themselves to go out and build their own maps. And I'm sure other people have built out information at a local level and other level to basically, whether it's through surveys or what have you, to get access to more granular information than what they're getting from the FCC.
And Eric, if I could just add, the purpose of our mapping effort was about accessibility, meaning availability at that location. at that location of whether you would have access to a minimum of a 25/3 service within 10 business days. And so it really addresses the availability and the accessibility of that, being able to subscribe to that service within 10 days. Some of the other approaches, can be confused with performance. We know performance can be an issue also, as well as affordability.
Well, Deana, this next question, you're going to like it. It says, is it safe to assume that we can traverse through served areas to reach unserved areas without being disqualified? I know you love that question.
Well, I would assume that it's most likely that you would traverse through served to get to unserved. Networks cannot be built in an isolated area without connecting back to some sort of network center. So I would think that now our intent and our hope and incentive would be to edge out networks to those unserved. But there are upgrades that are necessary in order to provide those services at a 25/3 level in those unserved areas. Eric, would you have anything to add to that?
No, I would agree with that. There's no way that there'd be too many islands out there. You're going to definitely have to traverse served areas to get to the unserved areas.
Well, Deana, I think in the grant program, you're allowing funding for both middle mile and last mile capital costs, right?
Well, as long as the result of the network is to connect an end user service.
In an unserved area.
Right. So the focus of the funds and the focus of the investment will be location specific, ultimately, to an unserved location.
Cool.
So eligible costs associated with building out to make the service available to the end user, the unserved location, will be a consideration for the project cost.
So if anybody in attendance wants to access the resources and information and the data, they would reach out to the contacts on the slide.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
So the broadband office is led at DCA with a team of DCA with Brittany Hickle and Jason Sale, but we do have an expanded team utilizing augmented resources throughout, different agencies like Georgia Technology Authority, Eric. The three of us have been the core team in implementing the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative since its inception in 2018, developing these tools and resources across the last couple of years.
Here's another question. Are ILECs going to cooperate with companies like Windstream to traverse to unserved locations?
Well,
I'd say we don't control the ILEC, so that's we don't have that control. We don't have that authority.
Well, I know that, but do you have a sense? Do you have a sense of whether there will be cooperation? I mean, my perspective is they all cooperate with each other today. I don't know why they wouldn't. I don't know why they wouldn't in the future, but I don't think we can say definitively everyone will cooperate in all instances, right?
That's right. I mean, and they all, to your point, Bill, they all have interconnect agreements today to serve different areas. And so I would expect that would continue. I have no reason to think that it wouldn't. Obviously, as you pointed out, we can't say 100%, but it is common practice for them to have interconnect agreements with each other in order to provide the services that they're already currently serving. So I don't expect that to be any different going forward.
Here's another question. So what would stop someone from using funds to build through a highly populated area, to go building through the served populated area to get to a small area for service, but then build out the highly populated served area with private funds?
Well, so applications will be evaluated on a proposed service area that is targeted and identified as unserved location specific. So, and then an assessment will also be looked at on what is the cost to reach those unserved locations.
But, the program is funding service to unserved locations, but the question being asked is there nothing stopping the receiving organization from taking their own money and building into served areas with their own private funds, right?
Well, if they're using private funds to build out, they get to choose where they invest those private funds.
Right.
What we are looking to do is to incent public investment with public funds in conjunction with private investment to those location-specific areas that are unserved.
I think that answered that question. If that didn't, Chris, just let me know. Here's another one. Let's see, has anyone considered using funds to encourage people to move to serve locations?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Well, they want to know if you're offering a financial incentive to people to move out of unserved areas into served areas.
You mean asking residents to physically move
Yep.
from home to a served area?
Yep.
Well, that's an individual's decision to do that. But I think that all of us get to enjoy the fact that we live where we choose to live. And I think we have to take into consideration that many people have built lives and a livelihood in the areas in which they reside. Some people are business owners. Some people have land and family there that goes back generations after generations. And so why would we be expecting or asking them to move and leave all of that behind, which is their livelihood, in order to go have internet access? I think we are a better Georgia and a better economy for Georgia if we allow people to thrive in the rural areas by providing services to them. We didn't ask people to leave because they don't have water or sewer or electricity. So why should we do the same with internet?
Right. Here's an additional comment about that earlier question about funding networks through served areas to get to unserved areas, and then the private sector or the awardee getting the money and then using their own money to build into served areas. This question statement here is that the bulk of the grant funds, could be consumed in building through served areas, right, to reach the unserved. And how's the state going to evaluate that? Or, how's the state feel about that, right? If the bulk of the grant being applied for is to build through served areas to reach the unserved.
So, that's where the evaluation of the engineered network that's being proposed to reach those unserved locations and the cost associated with that comes into play. As Eric had mentioned, we have done a cost analysis, which is intended to be used internally. It's a baseline measure against what's being proposed for an average cost. So if that proposed project does not connect those unserved locations, then and the network designed for it, and it's not a reasonable cost to reach those, then that will not be a very competitive application.
Okay, here's another question. What credence do you give to satellite internet and its recent advancements like Starlink? Do you see these services being on par with terrestrial broadband in the future?
Our current evaluation is that the satellite does not meet the state's definition of a broadband service. Therefore, when we, excuse me, when we're evaluating where federal funds invested in census blocks, and those include satellite, we as a state will not consider that as a service that meets the broadband service designation as defined in state legislation currently.
So for example, the state is excluding RDOF awarded areas but the Starlink awarded areas are still considered to be unserved, correct?
Correct.
That is correct.
Here's another question. What's the governance model for the grant program?
The governance model is through the One Georgia program at DCA. So it is governed by both DCA and the One Georgia program. I'll get into that a bit more in our program this afternoon.
Right. Okay, here's another one. If you stay on schedule, what percentage of Georgians will remain unserved when the program is complete?
Well, I think it's a little early to tell. I mean, we're making progress each year. Our overall approach is to look at many funding sources. We look at private investment. We know that private investment is happening all the time. We look to our private partners and how their strategic build out and what's happening around the state. We look at federal investment, but as well as state investment. There's a lot of funding that we see coming around as a result of COVID. So that could accelerate build out. So I think it's yet to be determined how that impact is going to look across the state and how it will change the landscape in the years to come, all as a result of COVID. COVID has been a challenge for many of us, but what it has highlighted is the need for broadband services, not only statewide, but nationwide.
I think we're around 9 or 10% today. Is that right?
That is correct.
And after RDOF completes, we go from 507,000 down to, was it 300 and something, Eric?
370 something thousand, correct?
And then there is an RDOF phase 2 planned, and then there's the federal $100 billion program. So there's so much going on. And then the state program, the governor has put in, I think, 30 million for the first grant year. Deana, is that correct?
Right.
And then there's at least 10 million already planned each year, right?
That's right. And Bill, the good news is that the approach that we have taken with the broadband office, certainly partnering with, of course, GTA and the GIS team at CVIOG, and that's led by Eric. Fortunately, we have set up a system with our mapping that will be able to track that progress. And as these investments are made and more locations are becoming served, we will be able to see that through our mapping effort.
Well, and we have a lot of electric co-ops that are either getting in the broadband business or considering getting in the broadband business, and that will make a difference. And even with Starlink, even though it's not a terrestrial equivalent today, if they're successful, low Earth orbit satellite speeds could go up, and that could be a viable option in the future. We've also looked at fixed wireless as another way to reach very difficult, high cost areas. So Deana, don't you think within 8 years, we probably won't have any unserved, or very few, right?
Right. I mean, we are seeing it shrink. And again, with the acceleration of addressing this and the way that it has been highlighted as a result of COVID, I think many through the presentations today have said, and I agree with them, that the shift and the transition to utilizing more online resources as a result of COVID is not a temporary. We see that this will be a permanent, to some degree, of how we can better utilize all these resources that we were sort of forced in a sense to have to use as a result of COVID.
Eric, this one's for you. Can Carl Vincent provide mapping services to non-government organizations?
We can, and we have, and that's not a problem. We can't provide, there are certain data sets, if you're looking for the granular data that we're using for building out the broadband maps, there are limitations in what we can provide there, but we most certainly can work with non-government organizations to provide mapping solutions.
There's another question. The percentage of locations served, is there a threshold of eligibility regarding those percentages?
is the question being asked, are they in order to be unserved in order to be served, 80% or greater of the locations in a census block must be served. And so that is the threshold that we define as being eligible. If it's above 80%, we're considering that census block to be served. And so it is only the unserved census blocks, those that have less than 80% of the locations served, that are eligible for the grant program.
So the state grant program funds are only available to unserved locations in unserved census blocks.
Correct.
Now that means that there are still unserved locations that we still have in served census blocks, correct?
Correct.
Right. What percentage of the total unserved 507,000 would you say are in served census blocks by our standard?
Very small percentage. Probably, you know, of the total unserved, I think it's, 40,000 or something like that are in served census blocks. And so 40,000 total locations. And so it's not a huge number. It is still significant, but it's usually one or two here and there. It's not as prevalent as one might think.
So out of 159 counties, the state grant program is eligible for all but 8, I think, right? Can you
Correct.
identify the 8 counties that the grant program will not be eligible for?
So Bill, that's based on that is based on the fact that the program is governed by One Georgia.
Right.
Those counties that are eligible, whether it is eligible or conditionally eligible, One Georgia program,
Yeah.
those counties that are eligible for the state broadband grant program.
I think the ones that are not are the 8 metro Atlanta counties. Is that correct?
Correct. Metro Atlanta County is correct.
Here's another question. Would it be difficult for Carl Vinson to do mapping outside of Georgia? Does being here allow access to unique information? So 2 questions. Would it be difficult for Carl Vinson to do mapping outside of Georgia? That's 1. And then 2, does being here allow access to unique information?
So first, I'll answer the second part of the question. Does being here allow access to unique information? We have been mapping inside the state of Georgia and been mapping in Georgia for 25, 30 years. And so we've been very heavily involved in mapping the state of Georgia for a long time. We have worked outside the state of Georgia in the past. We currently host and maintain the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Data Clearinghouse. So we map all over the world. As far as doing this level of mapping, this was a very large undertaking, but it is something that is possible to do outside the state, absolutely.
And I do want to give credit to the state because, DCA in legislation was charged with identifying where the unserved were. And we were very fortunate to have the resources of Eric's team for those. And where I want to give credit to the governor is where he appropriated $2 million for this mapping effort. And we are continuing it with University of Georgia for the next years to come, to continue to update so that we can track that progress.
So here's another question. How often are the maps being updated?
So we're continually updating the maps internally because we're working with providers, but we're on a yearly refresh schedule at the moment where we republish the map in total every June 30th of every year. And so the first map was published on June 30th, 2020. The next map will be published on or before June 30th of 2021.
So the grant program this year will use the new results?
Correct. The grant program this year will be using the new 2021 maps that we have just finished mapping here actually in the past week or so.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. The next thing is there's a networking break. And again, the links to the Zoom meeting rooms will be posted in the chat. There they are, they're in the chat. And then we will reconvene back here at 1:45, where Deana will take us through some pretty good detail on the state grant program. So 1:45, we'll come back and do that. And Deana and Eric, I want to thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye now.